You're listening to Wild Culture, a podcast discussing consumer culture and the powerful influence of business strategy. Hi there. So today I've got my coffee in hand and I've settled in because I want to have a pretty deep conversation around what is a fairly heavy topic, sometimes taboo when you're talking about business growth and particularly hustle culture. This is a topic nobody wants to talk about, even though this topic should have everyone everywhere talking about it. A brief note here before we get stuck in. This episode discusses modern slavery and contains descriptions that some listeners may find unsettling, graphic, or deeply confronting. If you feel this content isn't right for you today, please feel free to skip over this episode, take care of yourself, and we'll catch you in the next episode. So we're talking modern slavery, which is the topic most likely to keep a CEO up at night. And if you're in the hot seat of business decision making and you're building a brand, you need to have thought about this. You need to know where you stand on this issue. This is incredibly topical right now. We're at a point in time where businesses are actively working to reduce the incidence of modern slavery. We have relatively new legislation here in Australia, and there is a growing active movement to lessen its extent globally. And big brands are generally concerned, like they really worry about what consumers will think of them if they directly or indirectly treat workers inhumanely. But modern slavery can be quiet. You would have seen little icons on beauty products and toiletries that say vegan or cruelty-free, but we don't have icons that say kind to humans. And the idea that we would need to put labels on things that say no humans were harmed in the making of this product is a fairly revolting idea. But modern slavery can be occurring deep in the pipeline of where the product inventory actually comes from. That's what makes it quiet and often invisible, which can catch brands off guard. That's why many brands prefer to have what's called vertically integrated business models so that they can control what's happening in their own backyard because they own all of the different and various parts of the supply pipeline. Because they don't want to risk their reputation or social license to something that was invisible or hidden from them. And as much as there are those brands that would never, ever entertain or engage in any action that restricts a person's basic human rights or their dignity, there are brands who would and who do, which is absolutely incredible to think about. So you might be able to tell this is a space that is of immense personal and professional interest to me, specifically supply chain ethics when it comes to consumer culture. And that's because I've seen it firsthand. And I'll go into that more shortly. I think there is an unspoken rule in society where we go out, we shop, and some of the things we buy are just so damn cheap, right? But where are they being made? How are they being made? By whom? And for how much? What are those people paid? These are some of the big, heavy questions that many consumers, we try not to linger on for too long because I think it's painful to talk through what those answers might actually be and what that might mean for us. But it's an area where, as I said, I do have direct first-hand experience. I've seen it internationally. So I want to go into it. Hence the coffee. Let's start by defining what modern slavery actually means in the first instance. So if you're in unfamiliar territory, this will put us all on the same page. What it encapsulates is slave labor, servitude, and forced labor practices. But there's actually a few different dimensions to this. So I will pop a link in the episode notes that you can go and have a look and find more information there. Now, a lot of the time when people think about slave labor, their mind goes straight to the stories of children producing shoes, people being chained up, working underground in mines and being compensated in food with very limited safety protocols. Sometimes modern slavery isn't as obvious to an observer because the workers might be dressed really well in uniforms. Their demeanor might seem calm. The workplace can even look well appointed. It's not always blatantly on display. Modern slavery trickles from what feels like an over there problem and makes its way into the variety that consumers can purchase. So when you go out shopping and find those hot deals, when you see that something is unbelievably cheap, it's kind of a bit of a nod to check your ethical compass and ask yourself, will I or won't I buy that? Should I hold off till I know more? Do I know if this was made by people in a manner that I accept? Is this right for me? Or would I prefer to support brands that operate in a deliberately ethical way and refuse to support something that I'm really not sure of? But it's not just about bargains. This is happening behind the scenes on big ticket items too. I don't want people to be blindsided and think that this only happens with cheap, fast fashion. Some of the biggest ticket items, the things that we are heavily encouraged to buy, can deep in their supply chains be supporting these exact practices. So modern slavery sits throughout the manufacturing spectrum. There is a little bit of grey area here to clear up around the difference between how hard we work and the expectation we put on ourselves of how hard we should work. And the other is how hard other people work and whether we are okay or not with them being expected to work hard for a company to make a profit and to sell things to us via brands inexpensively. There's a big difference between those two. So I want to talk through what that hustle culture attitude and a very real and deliberate removal of human rights looks like. When we talk about modern slavery, there is really this distinct line in the sand. On one side, you have working conditions that are, frankly, taking the absolute piss. They're exploitation, underpayment, and wage theft. On the other side of that line lies actual slavery. So let's start with the first side of that line. I think we're all familiar with the term hustle culture, and I mentioned this at the top. There are probably a lot of listeners right now that will find that they have been in scenarios where they have worked overtime without pay, or they've skipped lunch to get something done, or they had the boss that got grumpy with them and maybe yelled at them to get a task done by 5 p.m. That whole vibe is a direct reflection of what we see online. So if you look at social media, it's flooded with influencers telling us to go hard, go all in. They push this narrative that working ultra hard is just the price you're going to have to pay for success. It's a necessary part of being good at what you do. That's not modern slavery. In Australia, if a job is completely and utterly destroying you, you can walk away. You can quit. You have labor laws, freedom, and flexibility. On this side of the line, you still hold power. you still have a choice, and there are protections in this country. Australia has one of the highest minimum wages in the world. The Fair Work Commission provides national protections for more than 2.6 million employees earning minimum wage. But globally, there are an estimated 327 million people earning minimum wage or less. 81% of those employees lack effective wage protection. What that means for workers in the 81% is that those laws either aren't being enforced or informal work arrangements prevent the protection that these laws could provide. It's largely those that are vulnerable that modern slavery affects. And this is what sits on the other side of that line in the sand. A lot of brands have been caught out by the media over the years for modern slavery, and it can be highly damaging for a brand to either knowingly or unknowingly be part of that, because their consumers, society, it's not something we're okay with. And that's why there is such a push to reduce or eradicate this. Now, when I was a young 20-something-year-old, I found myself exposed to it before I even had the maturity or self-awareness to understand that you can find yourself working for a company who is supporting these practices. You can gloss over details. For me, it wasn't until I was face to face with it that the reality and the magnitude of it set in. Until then, I thought it was something that happened to other people in other countries, and I just didn't think that I would ever work for a brand who would do this. It just wasn't on my radar at all at that age. So at that time, I was working for a massive global mega brand, and a mega brand in many different categories. And to be specific without getting into the exact genre, it was in the fashion industry. This is a company that had its head office right in the heart of that extreme wealth strip in New York City. You would recognize the brand name in a heartbeat. I was being paid a very underwhelming salary, but the job came with the perk that I got to travel the world and lead a team. And I was really excited about both of those things because I hadn't traveled by plane much in my life. I hadn't been overseas. So as a youngster, I just saw the good things about the brand and the role. So I really had my blinkers on. But at the same time, I just didn't know what I didn't know. And brands don't actively say where they're having products made. And often in the fashion industry, which is highly competitive, they change suppliers from time to time. So because of that role, they sent me around the world where I would go to conferences, meet leaders in color and textiles and style. I met counterparts. I went to runway parades. There was a big part of this job that was very glamorous. But I also interacted with suppliers. And, I don't talk about this very often because it's actually fairly difficult to talk about. When I met with suppliers, what I noticed was that there was a significant disparity in how I was working compared to how they were working. And that was instantly visible to me. So that was the moment when the blindfold was instantly removed. Now, I don't want to pinpoint the specific location for this, but it was outside of Australia. One of the suppliers that I met with had a factory, a manufacturing plant located in the middle of a regional community where the people living there surrounding that facility were impoverished. It was a fair distance from the city, and I remember being in the car and feeling uncomfortable about the distance, about how far west we'd driven away from the city. And I would liken the surrounding area to a desert, so very vast but very vacant. There were no crops. It was basically sand, the terrain, and there were a few hills. It was a very harsh living environment. That's what I would say. And so on the outskirts of that particular factory, you could see the human impact of what it was like to live in that environment. We pulled up to this factory, and to give you some idea of the scale, these factories are phenomenally huge. They are like the size of an Australian suburb. That's how big they are, except the whole suburb is a building. And I remember pulling up in a very fancy car, driving past human beings and into what was basically an oasis in the middle of the desert, with trees, albeit there was coiled barbed wire at the top of extremely tall fences. Inside the plant was quite luxurious, what we were initially shown. So the main showrooms, the entrance hall is not too dissimilar to a resort. So the architecture and the interior design was incredible. It's what happens behind the scenes of that facade. You need to scratch the surface to understand what's going on, because a lot of it is invisible or hidden from view, or it's controlled quite tightly. And to give you some idea what I mean by that control, we didn't see workers freely moving around the grounds. We didn't pass anyone in corridors. Yet there were thousands of workers and expansive halls that were lined with closed doors. Only certain doors were open for us to actually walk in and view workers. In one of those rooms, there were, to take a guess, I'd say there were like 100 rows by 100 rows of sewing machines, and each one was occupied by a worker performing just one process on repeat. That was their job. So you'd have a worker who just sewed the left side seam of a top, and then someone else would just sew a row of top stitching around a collar. So they were pumping through the work with speed and with high efficiency. What the working conditions of the workers were, well, I met one of the workers and I was able to have a moment with her, which was just an incredible moment. The workers at this factory worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they were employed on 7-year contracts, 7-year individual contracts where they weren't allowed to leave the premises. When she told me this, she said it like she believed it was a feature of working at this company. And she was living in the hope that when the contract ended, she would have sent enough money home to be able to start a family business. The workers themselves were young. I can't say that I saw anybody older than me, but I never saw anyone younger than a teenager. And that was what I saw. We were taken on various tours of the facility, and one of those included into the living quarters, in particular into the room of a young male worker. And the thing that kind of blew my mind as I was watching and observing and taking everything in was that they were accepting of the moment where we saw them stripped of their dignity and their privacy. When we concluded our visit, and we got back in the car to head back to our cushy hotel in the city, I remember sitting in the back of the car and just trying to keep it together. And that experience changed my entire thinking and understanding of how the things we live our lives in as consumers are made. And I hadn't ever thought about it until then, which is why I have such a strong interest in supply chain ethics. And it's why I studied this and I've spoken to experts in this field, because I needed to understand this. I needed to understand, why would anyone want to operate in this way? What the hell have I just come into contact with? Why would a mega brand willingly align with this? I needed to understand that. And what I learned through that exploration is that a major part of this system relies on what is called situational ethics, which is often framed as choosing the lesser of two evils. When you look at the communities surrounding these manufacturing plants, their world is really tough. For many of the people living in these impoverished communities, working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week under strict surveillance is viewed as the lesser evil compared to what they would otherwise have to do to survive. So I guess you can use your imagination to draw a conclusion there as to what would be worse than that and what options are left for survival in those environments. That is the choice they are forced to make. For us, living in countries with strict labor legislation, with democratic leadership and robust human rights frameworks, it seems unthinkable. But for someone else doing something that involves them working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and getting a meal and getting a bed, even if someone is occasionally going to look in on them, that's the lesser of evils. So it becomes a calculated choice for survival. And that doesn't make it right. And I'm not excusing these practices in any way, shape or form. Because for the vast majority of corporations engaging these factories, this isn't a philanthropic endeavor to provide jobs. It's just about profit. So when we talk about modern slavery, this gets packaged into the price of a cheap product or some of those high-tech premium goods. And when you're buying something and you're selling something, you have to know if this sits right with you. And if this is something you want in your supply chain and the process of what you've created. Now, I want to end this episode on something lighter and on a note of progress, looking at how we can make these practices less prevalent and lessen the reliance on vulnerable human beings to make things for us. And there are a couple of points of hope here. One is that modern slavery legislation works. We just need it applied widespread and actually enforced. Another is robotics and automation stepping in to take over a lot of those high volume, high repetition and physically punishing manufacturing tasks. And my hope is that as technology handles the grunt work, it frees people of sweatshop labor and it opens new doors for more meaningful and stable forms of work. So that is the breadth of today's episode. It's pretty deep, dark stuff, but a conversation that when we're talking about consumerism and brands that we absolutely have to keep having if we want to change the way that the world shops. So thanks for listening in. If you made it to the end of this one today, I know it was a big one. So thank you, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Till next time. Thanks for listening in to Wild Culture. If you found value in our conversation today, please make sure you follow or subscribe to the show wherever you listen. Taking a moment to leave us a quick rating or review is the best way you can help other curious strategists and passionate spenders find us as well. Bye for now.